Hello and welcome back to Well That Aged Well. And this week I'm joined by Michael Neiberg and we are going to talk about Vichy France. And he wrote a recent book about when France fell. And before we begin with talking about Vichy France, I want to begin because I feel like we have to understand interwar years in France in order to understand the Pétain government. So let's talk a little bit about the Third Republic and how France worked in the interwar years.
Yeah, the French Third Republic is designed to be a place where power is vested in the legislature and vested into a cabinet that is beholden to that legislature. So it is not a particularly strong form of government. The French have replaced it now with governments where the executive is much stronger. What that meant was that as the European political scene polarized into ever further right and ever further left, and as the economic problems of the Great Depression hit France, the Third Republic really had a hard time, really struggled to meet the succession of crises, both international and domestic, that hit France. And what it meant was that a lot of folks outside of the center really came to dislike the Third Republic, though it was very difficult constitutionally to make the changes that maybe would have helped it to survive. So it's a government and a system that is very slow in responding to major crises. And unfortunately, France went through many major crises in the 1930s, which weakened the Third Republic quite badly by the time the Great Crisis of 1940 came along.
I want to talk a little bit as well about international relations between Germany and the Third Republic, because it was a bit hostilities there in the interwar years, especially with the German industries. There were, the French government wanted quite a lot to say, as far as I understand, with the Weimar Republic and the industries in the Rhineland, and so let's talk a little bit about the relationships there.
Yeah, there are, I guess, there are several schools of thought in the French Third Republic. There is a group that wants to appease Germany. There is a group that is quite influential in that and was influential all the way down to the crisis of 1940. There was another group that saw Germany as the next potential threat to France, and then there was a group on the right that saw communism and were more influenced by what they were seeing in the Spanish Civil War and the fear that something like that could break out in France. And for many of those people, including many who formed part of the core of the Vichy French political system, they were more worried about what they saw happening in Spain than what they saw happening in Germany. So it's a complex process with a lot of people that had a lot of very different answers to the problem of what to do about Germany. Um, but for many French people, the crisis in Spain and even the threat from Italy was greater than the threat from Germany for quite a while because Mussolini was actively demanding parts of French territory, including Corsica, Tunisia, and even the city of Nice, which he claimed were Italian. And so that threat, I think, distracted a lot of people until really it was almost too late.
So I want to talk, and we have to talk a little as well, of course, about the Treaty of Versailles because it's kind of a red line in, at least in Germany, in the interwar years, of part of Hitler's main policy in this to define the Versailles Treaty. So, but how important was it for the French like, to keep the Treaty of Versailles, to uphold the Treaty of Versailles?
I think the question in French minds is what is the best way to handle Germany going forward? I think after the Ruhr crisis of 1922-23, which is very complicated, but in a nutshell, the Germans did not make reparations payments. The French sent soldiers into the Ruhr to try to enforce it, and it just turned into a political disaster. After that, I think the Treaty of Versailles is more or less a dead letter, 1922-23. There are not many French politicians who are talking about it, who really want to enforce it. The question is, what do you want to do in its place? And there is a group that wins a Nobel Peace Prize, Aristide Briand, for negotiating a treaty called the Treaty of Locarno with Germany that leads a lot of French people, not all, but a lot of French people, to hope that some sort of negotiation, some sort of modus vivendi with the Germans might be possible. And the Treaty of Locarno, the Germans agree to not ask for any border adjustments in Western Europe, though the question of Eastern Europe remains open. So the basis that they're working this on is really one of keeping the Germans focused on their problems in the East, which in retrospect probably wasn't going to work for very long, but may have worked had the Nazis not taken control in 1933.
Let's talk about that, how relations became when Hitler took power in 1933, and how French and German relations changed from the Weimar Republic a little bit.
Well, obviously, Hitler's accession to power is a terrifying moment for the French, mostly because of the rhetoric that he uses, and of course the things that he'll do later. But there is still a view among many in France that it will take Germany some time to really pose a threat to French interests. And there is an argument on the French right, articulated probably most by a man named Marshal Philippe Petain, who later became the Vichy Minister of Labor, who argued that what the Germans really want to do is change the status quo in the East, and that the French should not be sucked into a war. They should not, the phrase was, die for Danzig. So that there might be a way in which the French can accommodate Germany in the West, allow them to remilitarize the Rhineland, allow them to rebuild an army to a certain level, as long as the threat to French possessions was not great and France did not get suckered into a war in the East. So it's very complicated, and I think it's important for people to understand not everybody read the threat from Nazism as existential, not just in France, but in the United States and in Britain as well, until it was probably too late.
Which brings me to my next topic. When we see that Hitler, and again, I'm doing this kind of like a brief walkthrough right now, which I could discuss this much more detail, of course, but we don't have the time. But you have to talk about the French army as well and the Third Republic, because it's kind of, I feel like that is essential as well to understand how and why they fell so quickly to the German. And what's the thought of training more armed forces when you saw that Hitler took over the Czechoslovakia and of course later Austria and Czechoslovakia and later of course Poland? Was the talk about, when was there any talk about at all to build up the armed forces in France?
Yeah, this is not to defend what happens in 1940, but I think it is to explain it. And that is that France from 1919 until the outbreak of the Second World War is a status quo power. There is nothing that France wants except a maintenance of the peace. So in the 20s and 30s, the defense plan that fits that political aim the best is a defensive mindset, which is where you get things like the Maginot Line and you get the kind of army that France built. There are alternative voices that are making different arguments that are saying, look, we need to be prepared to do a variety of things. But the most convincing argument is that what France needs is a defensive mindset. And I think it just comes too late. But by the time that French defense officials realize that they may need something other than a defensive mindset, it's extremely difficult. And you're in the midst of the probably the worst part of the Great Depression, meaning that the money and the resources aren't there to do what they want to do. But the fundamental problem that the French face, unlike 1914, where the Germans need to think about their Eastern Front and their Western Front, in 1940, they only need to think about the West because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So this is what I mean when I say there's like this rolling series of crises that hit France. Just when you think you've got something figured out that you can work with, something earth-changing like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact happens that renders everything you've been doing virtually irrelevant. And French-British relations were not terribly good at this time either. So while I'm not asking anybody to overly sympathize with France in 1940, it is true that in 1914, France was faced with one problem, Germany, with the British as an ally, the Russians as an ally, and the Italians as a potential ally. Whereas in 1940, they're looking at a multitude of crises with one wavering British ally that may or may not come to their aid. So the strategic problem that they're facing is orders of magnitude harder than the one they were facing in 1914.
So let's talk about the German attack on France and how the Blitzkrieg became so successful. And again, I want to ask, and kind of hypothetical question, was there worry that there would be a stalemate like in 1914, that there would be trenches again, and that there would be kind of a stalemate between the two powers, that it would be exactly like, of course we know it wouldn't be, but was there worry that it would be the same as in 1914 again?
Again, there's a lot of disagreement in this. There were some French thinkers who thought that what France needed to do was to use the Maginot Line to, in a sense, repeat the strategic experience of World War I, by which I mean hold the Germans off long enough for the British to fully mobilize and the Americans and the Empire to eventually wake up and join the fight. There is a theory that what you're trying to do against Germany, which is larger than you are, angrier than you are, more interested in vengeance than you are, and now focused only on one front, the best you can hope for is to kind of delay what the Germans are going to do in time to get that help to come to you. There were others who argued that the right thing to do, and Maurice Gamelin, the French commander, is the guy who eventually wins this argument, you need to take the offensive so that you're not fighting a long, drawn-out war on your own soil. And this is the origin of what becomes known as the Dial Plan, which involves a French movement into the Low Countries so that the next war would be fought outside of France. What happens in 1940 is partly, I think, that the deck gets stacked too much against France in the ways that I've already talked about. And the German plan, the so-called Manstein-Sickle cut, actually hits the French at the worst possible place at the worst possible moment. So I'm reluctant to entirely call it luck, but there is an element of chance in here where the Germans are able to strike the French after they've advanced into Belgium, into the Dial Plan, and kind of come in behind them, which creates that great pocket that will eventually lead to the Dunkirk evacuation. So, my late friend Dennis Showalter used to argue that in 1914, all the 50-50 coin flips went to the French. In 1940, they all went to the Germans. And I think there's something in that. But of course, you sort of set the conditions of your own luck, if you will, and the French did not set the conditions of their own luck particularly well.
So let's talk about the defeat and of how the Germans entering Paris and the humiliating peace accord that would be, of course, set in the famous Versailles train that the 1918 peace.
Not Versailles. Yeah.
And of course about Hitler's brief visit to Paris as well.
Yeah, it's hard for us to see it now, and it was hard for them to see it then. But for the Germans, what this victory means is they only need to fight on one front. So what that means is, and by which I mean they can now go east without having to worry about a western front. So for the Germans, what the victory means is they're happy to create this strange political animal called Vichy France that will govern southern France and will govern the empire and will maintain the navy. In exchange, what the Germans get is an occupation over Paris, an occupation over the English Channel and Atlantic coastlines, which is very important, and control over the main French industrial regions in the Northeast. So it's an occupation, it's a defeat, it's certainly a humiliation for France, but the Germans do give the French this kind of out. And the reason they do that is because they're hoping that the Vichy French government will be able to control the Western Front for them and keep France calm, because they know, even though nobody else really knows it, that the war they're really going to go and fight is going to be out in the East. So they're trying to keep France calm. They're trying to keep it so that they don't need to occupy it in the same way that they're going to have to occupy parts of Eastern Europe, and so that they can keep the number of German troops in the West as low as is operationally possible.
So why choose the town of Vichy and not any other town like Paris or any? Was there any other strategic town, perhaps that city that should have been better suited for new French Nazi puppet government? In this case, why choose Vichy at all? Because
in 1940, the French are not thinking of this as a German puppet government, and even the Americans are not thinking of it that way. It is an independent state, unoccupied France, that will go back to a peace conference like happened in 1919, and will negotiate on the interests of France. And the expectation is that this arrangement will eventually produce the return of a sovereign French state, a fully sovereign French state in Europe when the Second World War is over. The choice of Vichy is intentional by the French, not the Germans. It's the French who make the decision to go to some place that is small, to go to some place that is relatively out of the way, to go to some place that will symbolize what Vichy expects the new France to be, which is agricultural, which is based on traditional French values, which is based in the family and the Catholic Church, which is the antithesis of what they see being the problem of Paris. which is that it's urban, it's chaotic, it's progressive. You have women who are not part of the family, they're out working. It's multi-ethnic with lots of refugees coming in, especially Jewish refugees. What they want is the opposite of that. And very few places in France look as opposite to Paris as does Vichy. So that's why the choice. It's out of the way, it's quiet. It's a place where they can begin to remake France from the inside, which is what they really want to do.
Now, we're going to come back to the draw in a few minutes, of course, but I want to talk about who famously said that the Third Republic never fell. So let's talk a little bit about the fall of the Third Republic and, how there was really no love lost and Vichy had quite a popularity, at least the first 1.5 years of their government. So let's talk a little bit about the first impressions of Vichy France and how we received, and we're going to talk about Pétain in a second as well. But I want to talk a little bit about how the Vichy government were received by the French people and how they were now lost for the Third Republic.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. There is a desire among, well, it's hard to know, but clearly a majority of French people for a government that would be stronger, more rapid, more agile, more authoritarian, less chaotic than the Third Republic. There are some people, and I guess we'll talk about one of them, who immediately reject Vichy and say that this government is not legitimate. It has no legal basis to govern. And then there's another group that goes by the French word for them is the attentistes, meaning the people that are just going to wait and see what comes. But for the most part, Vichy seems to be to the French people an answer to the chaos and the confusion that had been true in the late 1930s and in 1940. And as you noted, it's headed by a man in whom almost all French people trust at that point, and that's Marshal Philippe Petain.
Let's talk a little bit about Pétain and how he came to be the head of the government. And because, as far as I understand, he chose to stay in France, whereas de Gaulle, who began to rule the exiled government in London. So, Pétain chose to stay and sign a peace treaty instead. So, let's talk a little bit about how Pétain came to power and a little bit background on how it came to be the leading government.
Yeah, it's really important to note he becomes a French hero in 1916 to 1918, where he comes into the Battle of Verdun as commander of that sector. He puts in a number of reforms in the French army. There is another event in 1917 when there are mutinies after the failed Chemin des Dames offensive, and Pétain comes in again. He is commander of the French army at the end of the First World War, and he's one of the great pantheon of heroes of France after World War One. He's the only one of that great pantheon of heroes who's still alive by the late 1930s and into 1940. So he's a symbol of that great French victorious army of the First World War. He is politically very, very conservative, though he keeps a lot of that to himself. He was the French ambassador to Franco's Spain for a little while. It's not clear. I don't think it's fair to label him as an intellectual fascist, though he agreed with a lot of what the fascists wanted to do. What he was a traditional French conservative who wanted to roll back the clock to a France before the French Revolution. I mean, he really did. He wanted to take away a lot of the French symbols, and he did. He took away Bastille Day as a holiday. He took away the French liberty, equality, fraternity motto and replaced it with work, family, and fatherland. In 1940, he is a rock of stability in very chaotic France. So he steps in first as deputy prime minister and then as kind of acting prime minister of the French government. And he's the guy who essentially tells the French people the battle on the front is lost, and we really have no choice but to accept the phrase that he will later coin. We have to accept collaboration with Germany in the new Europe.
I want to ask as well about the French army after the fall, because was it a mistake of Hitler not to, because it shows famously, as we know, not to use the French army draw it into the Wehrmacht. So was it a mistake on his behalf not to use, or was it the right thing to do, not to
Well, had the Germans done anything sorry, had the Germans done anything remotely like that, it would have been a violation of the 1940 armistice terms, and I don't think the French would have accepted it. So, what the Germans want out of France is not a kind of army in waiting that they can use. What they want out of France is a place that they can draw money and natural resources out of and can use as a springboard to threaten the British, either from the sea or from the air or a potential amphibious landing. They don't want large numbers of French soldiers serving in the German army, both because that would make France very difficult to govern, and because it would likely not work, to be quite frank. So I don't think there was any intent to do that. They didn't even take the French fleet, which they might have thought about doing, a very modern and very powerful fleet. That also remained under the control of Vichy. So it's not the intent to sort of absorb France. It is rather the intent to neutralize it.
So something I want to talk about is the dividing of France, because there is one occupied zone, there is one part that goes to the Italian land, as tiny little small town, and then you have Vichy France itself. So let's talk a little bit about the logic behind the dividing of France after the fall.
The logic is to give Germany control over the main coal and iron ore fields, give Germany access to the English Channel so that you can threaten Britain directly, give access to the Atlantic Ocean. And what the Germans will do there is create 3 major U-boat bases at Lorient, Nazar, and Brest, that they can put their U-boats directly out into the Atlantic Ocean. As to the rest of the country, Lyon and Marseille and the rest of it, they really don't care. It really doesn't matter to them as long as nothing in that sector is harmful to their interests. So they're content to leave that in an unoccupied, theoretically independent and theoretically neutral zone known as unoccupied France, later Vichy France. The key is that Vichy maintains control over the French Empire in North Africa, and that's going to and in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's going to be really, really important to the geopolitics of the rest of this war.
Let's talk about some policies by the Vichy government, and I'll be going to come back to the Jews a little bit later, but let's begin with how they issued politics in the new France.
The goal, as I said earlier, was really to wind the clock back, return France to a nation where the Catholic Church was an important institution, where small businesses and large families is the way that sometimes it's described, and return France back to a more traditional and more authoritarian kind of a system. What that means for a lot of people in Vichy is that all of the migrants who had come to France in the 20s and 30s did not fit that definition of quote-unquote Frenchness or La France profonde, and they were going to have to leave France one way or the other. It is a system that is xenophobic. It is anti-Semitic. It is, above all, trying to return France to a political ideal that they believe existed before the revolution, which they see as a terrible event in French history.
How did the French, when the Germans first came into France, what were the perception of the German Wehrmacht soldier? Because it didn't seem to be too bad at first. Of course, we're going to talk about resistance a little bit later on. But what were the French view of the German soldier that that first came?
For the most part, the experience is as good as one could expect following what had happened in 1940. German soldiers are told that they should pay for things, they should hold doors open for ladies, they should, that they should behave properly. That doesn't really begin to change until, I guess, 2 things happen. One is that in 1942, the British and the Americans begin to clear North Africa, which means that it is possible that there is a better future. So there's something that resistance can build toward. And the second thing that happens is that the French begin something called the STO, which is a mandatory labor draft that many French people see as being pro-German. So I think it's fair to say, painting in very, very broad brushes here, that many French were okay with Vichy as long as it was an independent French entity. To the extent that people began to see it really as a client state of the Germans, then you see resistance begin to build in a way that it hadn't before.
I want to talk a little bit as well about the art looting, and of course, where the famous late in 1944, where the famous monument men would come to try to rescue the art. But I want to especially talk about the art looting when the French came, sorry, the German came into France, and of course, during famously would take a lot of art for his mansions and castles
Yeah.
back to Germany.
A lot of that art is coming out of Jewish-owned art galleries, or they're Jewish-owned paintings. So there is less of a cry from the French state. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And trying to remember her name, Anne Sinclair, I think, has written a book called My Grandfather's Gallery about this. She owned a gallery. Her grandfather owned a gallery in Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris. So a lot of this art is being taken from people who were being deracinated. Their French identity was being taken away from them. A lot of them Jews or Spanish migrants even that had come into Paris. Picasso being one of them. So this is art that in the minds of the occupiers now does not belong to any French citizen. Therefore, it's free game. So I have to be honest with you. I have not seen The Monuments Men. I don't usually go to too many history movies because I end up.
So it's based on, of course.
Yeah. So, but it's been an issue that has continued to be a difficult one. Getting art properly returned to the families that from whom it was stolen, from whom the Germans and French stole it, I should say. Keep it in the active voice. And being able to prove provenance and prove ownership has been an extraordinarily difficult issue.
Let's talk a little bit about Vichy propaganda, how it would remain, and was it very pro-German? I believe it was very pro-German propaganda under Vichy government.
So again, I would say in the early phases of the Vichy government, it's not necessarily pro-German. What it is trying to do is say that we have an independent French state. There is an occupied part of France, but the Germans have not annexed it. They're occupying it. So again, it's a terrible strategy, but I think we have to understand what Vichy was attempting to do. Their argument was, we in the Vichy state, which controls the empire, we are the holders of the titles to France, in effect. What will happen is the Germans, the great land army, a great land power in Europe, will not be able to defeat the British, who are the great sea power of Europe. Therefore, there's going to have to be a peace conference. At that time, we'll figure out what the price of our defeat is. It might be Morocco, it might be Alsace-Lorraine, it might be reparations. But the expectation is at that peace conference, Vichy will be able to position itself between the British and the Germans and get back full sovereignty for France. Now, there are certainly people looking at this who say, you got to be insane to believe that this is actually what's going to happen. But it's what a lot of Vichy people believe until the summer of 1941, when the Germans invade the Soviet Union. And then it becomes obvious to a lot of people in Vichy, the Germans might lose this war. So we need to be thinking about an alternative strategy in the event that Germany loses. But outside of some folks let me rephrase that. Not everybody in Vichy understood themselves to be pro-German. They understood themselves to be protecting French interests. And those French interests meant that you had to have a positive relationship with Germany, both because the Germans were sitting in Paris and because it was possible that Germany would win the war and set the terms of that peace. There are exceptions, but a lot of people in Vichy would have said, and I think many of them would have believed, they were looking out for the interests of France. They were not looking out for the interests of Germany. Unless, of course, those interests overlapped.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about governing the empire. And as you said earlier, North Africa would be vital for, the campaign on retaking Europe. So let's talk a little bit about how they would manage their empire, and of course North Africa, as they get the famous North African campaign as well.
Yeah, this is the one thing that all French political movements from Charles de Gaulle to Vichy agree on, and that is that North Africa is an integral part of France. Algeria is considered French, not part of the empire, but it is considered to be French. If you're of European descent and living in Algeria, you have full political rights in the French parliament. So Algeria is considered France, period, dot, end of story. Tunisia is a protectorate. Morocco it's a very complicated political picture. What all of the French politicians all across the political spectrum believe is that whatever happens when the war is over, French control over North Africa must remain, especially Algeria, So control over Algeria is a critical thing for de Gaulle, for Henri Giraud, for all of these various movements that are going to emerge. So the fact that it's the British, the Americans, and the Germans who have military force in North Africa doesn't change what they believe to be the political reality, that these are French territories. They will remain French territories, and they will forever be French territories, no matter what political system is about to come through.
There was, as far as I understand, according to Julian Jackson, there was worried that the Allies would attack some of the colonies and go in from there, that they would attack the French colonies and take over the French and go, and like I said, from there.
Yeah, I mean, most people who run Vichy are some are pro-American or some want to work with the Americans, but they are also aware that Roosevelt has a very strong anti-imperial streak in him. So they are worried that the United States might come in and turn governance over to the native Algerians or Moroccans or Tunisians, which in their minds is absolutely unacceptable. They are also, of course, worried. Another thing that unites most Vichy people is they're quite suspicious to outright hatred of the British. And they are worried that the Brits might take bits and pieces of the French Empire or support the Americans in the American desire to dismantle the French Empire. So, yeah, there's a lot of concern, both about what the Germans might do to the empire and also what the British and the Americans might do to it.
Let's talk a little bit about international relations with Vichy, because of course the Axis powers would immediately recognize the government, but the British and the Allies would, of course, call it illegitimate. Though at this early, the first few months, I believe the British government would work secretly behind the scenes with Vichy government. So let's talk about recognitions and international relations with Vichy France.
Yeah, the most important country that recognized Vichy was, of course, the United States. Britain never acknowledged Vichy, never recognized it. So their foreign relations are really characterized by trying to keep in balance the Germans and the United States. So what they hope to get from the United States is international recognition that they are an actual state. They want the United States to reject Charles de Gaulle and not give him any support. And they're hoping to build some economic relationships, especially in food, oil, some manufactured products that the United States can sell or provide to the state. They're not very successful in their foreign relations because it's pretty obvious to most people that Vichy may not be directly a German puppet state, but that it is not a fully independent state either, and that it's not going to take any action that the Germans disapprove of, which is why the British are telling the Americans, you guys are nuts to recognize this country. They're not a country. They're a semi-Axis power, and any aid that you give them could either be given to the Germans or could be used to kill Britons and Americans. So the British and Americans disagree quite strongly over this, and Vichy's trying where it can to exploit that disagreement.
Now we have to talk about, of course, the exile government under de Gaulle, and I want to talk about how de Gaulle came into power as well, I suppose, and he wasn't a very well-known figure until he became leader of the exile government in London. So that's how did they get this kind of? I hesitated to use the word power, but because it's an exile, I don't know. I'm not too familiar with the exile government, but that's how did de Gaulle climb to the top of the exile government in London?
Your question's a great one because until almost they had no choice, the United States did not recognize that Charles de Gaulle was the leader of a government. They recognized him as leader of a committee, literally. What happens is that de Gaulle just made this decision in his own head that Vichy was illegitimate. It in effect was no government. It was an emergency government, a government of cowards, is what he thinks. So instead of staying and having to face the choice of serving that government, he's offered the opportunity by a guy named Edward Spears, a British general. He's offered the opportunity to get into an airplane, oddly on Waterloo Day, and fly to London, which he does. And from there, he gives a speech on BBC from a place called Carlton House, right near Pall Mall. You can go there today. I was just there not that long ago and see the statue to de Gaulle that's there today. and he gives this fabulous speech that you'll see printed on metal placards and posted all over public buildings in France. So he's not the leader of a state, but he is instantly a leader of a movement, of a movement that does not acknowledge Vichy's existence. And de Gaulle, in that famous speech, predicts the outcome of the war. He says that France has lost a battle, it has not lost a war, that the British, he doesn't use this quite this way, but he says the British, the Americans, and the French Empire are going to rise up and they're going to defeat the Germans. And he says at that moment, France must be present at the moment of victory. And he gets it exactly right.
I do believe it's a little bit funny though that he do get some airtime every day, but sometimes the BBC would try to stop him because they're not necessarily big fans of the girl themselves. So it's kind of a little bit funny how they would try sometimes to, even though he wasn't really on air, he just told he was on the air sometimes.
He's the leader of a group first called the Fighting French and then called the Free French. So he's not the head of a government. He sometimes behaved as though he were the head of a government. So he was a difficult person for the British to deal with. He had a way of angering the very people whose help he was asking for. So he's not an easy guy to get along with. So it's not unreasonable that the British would not want to give him a completely, give him too large of a soapbox. They were being careful with him, as they should have.
Now, it is time for us to talk a little bit about the resistance under Vichy France, because, again, as Julian Jackson argues in his monumental book on Vichy France and how France ended up occupying years, and it was more or less a minimal, but as he argues, there were several ways of resisting. It wasn't just fighting against the German or Vichy government.
Mm-hmm.
It was more, we had flyers. There were huge number of subscribers to resistance papers and as well. So let's talk a little bit about the various ways that people would resist the Germans.
Well, I think it's more complicated, and what we also have to recognize is that there isn't one French resistance. There are royalist French resistance that are trying to find the Orleanist pretender who's living in Morocco as a pig farmer, I think. They want to put him back on the throne as a kind of unifying French king, all the way to the communists who are doing most of the active fighting in the cities, in Marseille and in Paris and in Lyon, to socialists like the great French hero Jean Moulin. They run the gamut politically, and they don't always agree on what they want France to become when this is over. What they're agreed on is that the German occupation is absolutely unacceptable, and that Vichy has no authority given to it from either the French people, which is what the communists would argue, or the legitimacy of the French dynasty, which is what the Orleanists would have argued. So it's a mishmash, and it's very, very interesting to read the American intel reports and British intel reports as they're trying to figure out what this thing called the French resistance is. And they're really having a very, very difficult time figuring it out. And the reason for that is it isn't one thing. It's many multiple things. And as you pointed out, it's also the tiny acts of resistance that French people engage in. The French word for a fishing pole is a gull. So people would walk down the street sometimes carrying two fishing poles, de gull in French. Some people would wear blue, white, and red colors. Those are small symbolic acts of resistance, all the way up to collecting intelligence and passing it on, helping downed American and British special operators, all the way to people like the ones that planned the assassination of Jean-François Darlan, one of the key Vichy officials. So it really does run the gamut from minor acts of resistance all the way up to organized violence.
Let's talk a little bit more about the communist resistance, because like you said, they were kind of a big part of the resistance. How did they fight? And of course, as we know, they wanted a communist France after the Second World War, but as we know, Stalin did not. And we will come back to this afterwards, I'm sure. But Stalin were not interested in this because he wanted to be in good foot still on with the Allies, so it was not in his interest to have a communist France. But let's talk a little bit about the communist resistance as well, because it's a really fascinating part of the French resistance history.
Yeah, a lot of those guys are communist agitators or trade unionists from years past. Many had fought in the Spanish Civil War, including probably the most famous today, a man by the name of Henri Roltanguy, who was an electrician who had worked on the Paris metro. So if you go to Paris, you can go to the Place d'Enfer Rochereau, and there is a museum to the liberation of Paris there. And you can actually walk down. You have to go with somebody because it's a little dangerous. But you walk down this flight of steps and you can see the headquarters that Rolls set up underneath the city of Paris. So these were people that knew the city extraordinarily well. They knew its metro tunnels, they knew its electricity cables, they knew everything. And they were extremely well organized. They tended to live in parts of the city where the Germans and the Vichy police didn't really want to go. And they tended to be extraordinarily good at keeping low and organizing, because that's what they had to do before the war. So they are extremely dedicated, patriotic in their own way, suspicious of de Gaulle in some ways, but willing to work with him. And the deal that eventually gets cut is that they, the communists, agree to serve de Gaulle until there are elections in France. And they agree to abide by those elections. De Gaulle, in his turn, agrees that he's not just going to set himself up as dictator of France. He will, when the war is over, set up elections, and they're going to write a new constitution, what becomes known as the Fourth Republic. And that's the deal that they cut. So it's not just that Stalin doesn't support the uprising. It's people like Henri Rotungui who say, look, we're willing to do this through the democratic system. We're willing to get the Germans gone and then figure out what the French people want.
Now we have to talk a little bit about the newspapers as well, because like I said, they had quite a few number of thousand subscribers. And was it dangerous to work with a resistant newspaper in Vichy France? Could you be caught with penalty? What about the penalty if you were caught with a resistant paper? And what was the risk of running one in Vichy France?
It was risky for sure. People would talk about reading a newspaper and then leaving it in a public place, like leaving it on a seat in the metro so the next person might look at it and leave it. But very risky indeed. Running a printing press, something like that, could get you sent to a camp or to a prison. I'm not sure that you would have gone to prison merely for holding a resistance newspaper, but it's maybe not the chance that you want to take either. So very, very dangerous operation that they were doing, but it is a way to at least communicate the sense that there is a movement for resistance out there. And Agnès Humbert, one of the more famous French resistants, she talks about that. Just the fact that you would see these newspapers would let you know that you're not alone, that somebody else is feeling what you're feeling and somebody else is sharing the sentiments that you have. So I think very important for morale and very important for just communicating that idea.
Now we're going to talk about the Jews involved, but there are a few more topics I want to discuss before we get there, and one of them is Laval, who would come into the Vichy government. So let's talk a little bit about him and how he came to be running a government with Pétain, and how he would kind of become, after 1942, the main figure of, I believe he would become the main figure of Vichy France.
He is, and he's one of the most loathsome people that come out of Vichy, and that's saying a lot, because a lot of really disgusting and loathsome people came out of Vichy. He's a political opportunist. He shares Petain's vision of remaking France from the inside. He is more pro-German than most of the Vichy folks are. He is more anti-British. At the same time, he claims to be pro-American. He has a son-in-law who is a statutory American citizen because he descends from the Marquis de Lafayette. So he's going to try to leverage that relationship. He is a slippery, unpleasant, nasty, xenophobic, anti-Semitic. I don't know how many bad adjectives I can throw on top of him. An extraordinarily unpleasant person. The Americans who are watching Vichy, one of the kind of metrics they're using, how much authority does it seem that Laval has at any given point in time? If it looks like his authority is getting stronger, then the Americans have less faith in Vichy as a potential political partner. To the extent that his authority has periods where it looks like it's weaker, the Americans get more willing to take a chance on Vichy. But Laval's an extraordinarily unpleasant and distasteful human being. At the end of the war, they give him a very quick trial, and they do execute him. Almost everybody who saw that trial said this is probably not a fair trial. Almost nobody cared.
Now, next on the list is collaborations with Vichy, and how collaborations with the Germans as well, and how, of course, we'll talk a little bit about more about this at the end of the occupation. But let's talk about collaborations and what would count as, because again, it's, as far as I understand, it's a bit of a gray area what you can call collaboration as well under Vichy France. So let's talk a little bit about this issue.
Well, Laval always claimed that he was cutting deals with the Germans whereby France was getting more than it was giving back. So in his mind, it wasn't collaboration. That's a tough argument to make.
I mean, general collaboration with people, and how.
Oh well, I mean,
with German soldiers, and
there were. Yeah, I think there was a kind of almost a moral economy that was going on in France. I think for most French people, if you sold stuff to the Germans to feed your family, that was considered kind of one crime. If you gave the Germans names of fellow French people or did something that actively led to the death of a French person, that's different. So, I think there was a kind of attitude in France. If you did what you had to do in order to survive, that's one thing. If a woman to take a French officer or a French soldier as a lover for a while is one thing. To use that position to enrich yourself or to turn other people in or to do something that led to harm to other French people, that's the line that went into collaboration. So I think there was actually a lot of flexibility, I suppose is the word, given to sort of daily interactions that people needed to do to survive and to feed their families. That was one thing. But to actively assist the Germans, that's something else. And there were French people who did that, most of whom ended up, for women, getting their head shaved at the Liberation, for example, or people that went on trial or went into exile at the end of the war, as many did.
Now, something I want to talk a little bit about as well is there was famously food shortages during the occupation. So let's talk a little bit about how food became kind of the new economy. If you had food, you had the power. Especially German officers would use this advantage on French girls they're starving as a way to get to them. So let's talk a little bit about how food became the new power in Vichy France.
Yeah, no doubt. The Germans are taking as much food out of the country as they possibly can, especially as the war tends to go less well for them, and they need to keep feeding the population back in Germany and keep them comfortable so they don't recognize just how bad things are. France doesn't pay as bad a price as Poland or some other places do, but it certainly pays a price. And the D-Day landings actually compound the problem because it cuts Paris and the major cities off from Normandy, which was one of the main sources of beef and dairy and fruit for the French people in those big cities. So food is a serious problem in France. And everybody that went through Paris in 1944 after the liberation, almost everybody comments on it, just how underfed and thin Parisians look. For that reason, I think, again, if you did what you had to do to get food to your children, I think most French people looked the other way at that. To do what some people like Coco Chanel did, to live in the Ritz Hotel and live very well while the rest of the city was starving, that's a much more complicated problem.
No, that's of course, and I've been waiting for this because there's a lot of other topics I want to discuss first, but we have to discuss and again I'm quoting here, the Jewish problem. So let's talk about, because of course the German army as well realized that they needed the help of the French police, and they couldn't get rid of so many Jews in France without the help of the French police. So let's talk a little bit about that kind of the French police collaboration with getting rid of the Jews, and how the Vichy government kind of just did buy in this, and they would later claim that they always send more Jews than we send out, but that's not really the case, is it? Because they
didn't stand by. They were active participants in the deportation
I believe
of Jews.
They would say later they tried to stop things and tried to.
Yeah, they were lying to cover their tracks. Yeah, they were clearly lying to cover their tracks, and the evidence is now overwhelming. If you go into the Resistance Museum that I talked about in Paris, one of the first exhibits that you see is a document with Petain's own handwriting in the margin approving the deportation of foreign-born Jews. France had accepted the largest number of Jewish refugees in Europe in the 1930s and 33 to 39. And it is the effort of Vichy first to get rid of the foreign-born Jews and then to begin the deportation of France's own Jewish population. So two things are true. One is that a French-born, a Jew living in France had a much greater likelihood of survival than a Jew living in, say, Poland or some other place in the East, most other places in the East, and that the Vichy government was actively trying to get rid of Jews, not so much because of the pressure coming from Germany, but because of Vichy's own anti-Semitic inclinations. So the French are doing a much better job of owning up to this reality. There's a place called Drancy in the Paris suburbs where many Jews were rounded up before being sent to Auschwitz and murdered in the death camps. And if you go to the Drancy Interpretation Center, there's very little actually about Germany in that center. It is about what the French did to other French. And there is a recent wonderful podcast called Covering Their Tracks, which is about what the French Railway Company, the SNCF, did, getting paid per Jew per kilometer to deliver French Jews and foreign-born Jews living in France from France to the death camps. So it's a deep complicity by the French state, by the Vichy French state, that modern France, I think, is starting to do a very good job of recognizing and beginning to face.
I especially want to bring up, and do forgive me if I say this name wrong, the Velodrome d'Hiver.
Veldiv, the Velodrome d'Hiver.
Let's talk about the round of Vel d'Hiver.
Yeah, this occurs in 1942, spring of 1942, where the French police round up a lot of foreign-born Jews. I believe Hannah Arendt is in that original Rafla or roundup. It's the Velodrome d'Hiver is an indoor bicycle racetrack that is a really squalid and terrible place. Jews are held there with very little food, very little water, very few sanitary facilities. Many of them, including a lot of children, end up being deported from there to the death camps. If you go there today, there is it's no longer there. It's now a housing block. But there is a lovely memorial garden to the Jews murdered from the Veldiv. And a short walk away, there is another monument that's there, neither of which make hardly any reference at all to the Germans. It is about what the Vichy state did to its own people. And my friend Annette Becker wrote a book about this. The book translates to something like Jews betrayed by their own France. That it was the French state doing this to French Jews.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the end of Vichy France and the liberation of Paris, and of course D-Day, and how this would turn the war around.
Well, Vichy ends earlier than that. When the United States and Britain landed in North Africa in Operation Torch, the Germans responded by doing a lot of things, one of which was to cross the demarcation line between occupied and unoccupied France. Once they crossed into unoccupied France, Vichy was effectively over because it no longer exists if the Germans are sending troops through it. So from then on, all of France is occupied. There are French groups that continue to fight with the Germans or continue to fight for a collaborationist French government. But Vichy itself doesn't really exist in the same fashion. It is now a full occupation of all of France. At that point, I think it's fair to say everybody but a few diehards in the United States recognized that whatever was going to be France when the war was over was likely going to be led by Charles de Gaulle. So there is this process where people come to the realization that the Vichy experiment is over. You're not going to go back to the Third Republic. You don't want a communist revolution. It's unlikely that the pretender, this Orleanist pretender, is going to have any support at all. So it's likely going to be Charles de Gaulle. And it took a while. I would say it took almost until D-Day for most people to figure this out. The U.S. Army even prepared a plan called AMGOT for the occupation of France. But I think by the time of June 6, 1944, it's pretty obvious to anybody seriously paying attention that Charles de Gaulle is the future leader of France.
What were the popular opinion by the end of Vichy France? Because we talked about how there were some support for it and there were no loss for the Third Republic by the beginning of occupied France. But what about the end of Vichy France and when they finally fell? What are the popular opinion there?
That's hard to judge, but Vichy still to this day has its people who support it and who say that Vichy protected France from the worst of German excesses. There are people like the French presidential candidate and media star Eric Zemmour who still argue that Vichy did a lot of good things. So there is still this kind of sentiment in France that I really don't know how popular it is, though my sense is it's not particularly popular at all in the cities. Um, that Vichy did quite a bit. There was this idea going around for quite a while that Pétain was the shield and de Gaulle was the sword, and they really both represented France. I mean, it's a ridiculous idea, but it held sway for a long time in France. Vichy today is is a word that most people use derogatorily and negatively. But again, you do have French political movements that argue that France needs to stop feeling bad about Vichy because it did a lot of good things.
Now let's talk about de Gaulle re-entering Paris, and there were kind of some people did not want him to go in that early because it was still dangerous, of course, because there were still Germans there, but he still did it anyway. So let's talk a little bit, and I must confess, I'm not the biggest fan of de Gaulle, but let's talk about him, and I want to especially talk about his liberation speech, and I'm going to try to quote it right now. So it's that where he says, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated by itself, liberated by its people, with the help of the armies of France, with the support and help of the whole of France, the France that fights, the only France, the true France, the eternal France. And it's kind of a little bit arrogant, though, I think, not to acknowledge that it would be nothing without the Allied powers helping. So why was there a reason why I didn't choose to acknowledge the Allies' help in here? And it's again, it's a bit, I don't know, it's a bit it's that one of the reasons I'm not the biggest fan of him, maybe, but is there a reason behind why he chose not the acknowledgement there?
Absolutely. What he's trying to say is he's trying to do two things fundamentally, and he did it even before that in Bayeux in northern France, shortly after the Allies landed. What he's trying to do is say two things. One, France, as he said in 1940, France will be present at the moment of its liberation. What he's trying to say 4 years later is that mission accomplished in effect. Like France was here. It was the French Second Armored Division that was the first unit into Paris. As you acknowledge, certainly with help from the Americans, though not the British, who are north of Paris and going in a different direction. But the first unit in there is a French unit, this elite Deuxième Division Blindée, and the French resistance inside the city did most of the fighting, killing, and dying before they got there. So he's got a point. The other thing that he's trying to do is say, look, if Paris liberated itself, if Paris and the French fought for themselves, then the Americans have absolutely no right to leave an occupation force inside France. They have absolutely no justification, no political justification whatsoever. What de Gaulle is saying to everybody, you can read it as arrogance if you like, but what he's saying to everybody is France is back. France has a state. France has a government. Vichy is what he calls un parenthèse. Vichy is a parenthesis in our history. We're going to close the parenthesis now, and we're going to move forward. We're not going back to the Third Republic, but we are going to establish a fourth. And it will be French people who will decide what the Fourth Republic looks like. It will not be an American occupation army.
If I may chime in, de Gaulle never acknowledged that the Third Republic fell, though. He did not want to declare a Fourth Republic.
According to him, the Third Republic is still in existence. What the French will do, however, is decide for themselves, because unlike the American Constitution or the American system, where the Constitution, whether governments rise and fall doesn't matter, administrations come and go, the Constitution is stable. In France, that's not the case. They've rewritten their Constitution, and they're on their Fifth Republic right now. And that's what de Gaulle is saying, that we're going to move from a Third Republic to a Fourth Republic. But the decisions about what that process will look like, Americans will have nothing to do with. The British will have nothing to do with. An occupying army will have nothing to do with. France is going to do that. And it certainly is arrogant, I guess, but I give de Gaulle credit. It is largely because of him. There was no American occupation of France. There was a French occupation sector in Germany. France is a founding member of the United Nations with a Security Council veto, and much of that is through is through what de Gaulle was doing and the actions and the cards that he played from 1942-43 into 1945-46.
Let's talk about the trial, and I'm going to call it, of course there's a different name, but I'm going to call it the Nuremberg trial of those who have collaborated with the Vichy government and the little bit aftermath of the victory in 1944, and how like you said, the shaving of the woman who slept with German officers and soldiers. And again, this wasn't happening all over Europe when the liberation fell into happen here in Norway as well. The woman who slept with German officers, they got their heads shaven. So it wasn't a common thing. That was happening all over occupied liberation areas. So let's talk a little bit about the feeling of Paris and how and France when the liberation happened and the trials and the aftermath of and forming the new de Gaulle government that will last pretty much until late 1950s.
So this is another thing that de Gaulle did. He came in and said, look, if we're going to have a state, these extrajudicial, in French, the épuration sauvage, the kind of wild purging, has to stop. We have to have a legal system and a police system and a judicial system that is worthy of the state. So he put a stop to all of those things that you're talking about. And France went through a period of trials. They put Pétain on trial. Julian Jackson's written a brilliant book about that. Laval and a couple of others on trial. Laval, they executed. Pétain, they found guilty. They were going to sentence him to death. That de Gaulle commuted that sentence and let Pétain live out his days away from most French people on an island off the west coast. They did execute Laval. He is buried at the Cimetière de Montparnasse in the middle of Paris, on the south side of Paris. And I have French friends that when I'm there with them in Paris, because Montparnasse is a very nice neighborhood. Sometimes we'll walk through the cemetery just to make sure, Laval's still under there as a kind of symbol of that's where he belongs. But the trials in France are as politically sensitive as those in Germany. Some people arguing that it made no sense to put people like Laval and Pétain to death. Others arguing that, as they did in Germany, that the trials did not go nearly far enough. They did not put nearly enough people on trial. And there would be people like Maurice Papon and others over the years whose Vichy past would come back to light. And France was having trials into the 80s and even into the 90s of people who committed crimes against humanity while serving Vichy's government.
What about the police who helped round up the Jews and especially leveled sorry, I'm not trying to say it because I don't say the roundup, Jewish roundup. I'm gonna say the name wrong, so I'm gonna try to not say the name. But it's where the police that were punished that helped round up the Jews and send them to the concentration camp, and how were the many Jews who survived, how were they welcomed into France when those few who returned to France after the war ended?
Yeah, the majority of police officers, of course, don't, just as the majority of German soldiers don't face. It's the leaders, it's the officers that are responsible. And this is usually the way that these things end up getting handled. Officers have a greater responsibility. They have a greater leadership responsibility. They have a greater responsibility for issuing orders. The history of Jewish people in France is a complex one. France had a Jewish prime minister after the war, Pierre Mendès France. France, this is one of the things I love and find so interesting about France. It is a place that certainly has its share of anti-Semitism and has its share of problems, as all states do, all places do. But it also has this very strong tradition that people of all backgrounds are welcome in France as long as they accept French values. And they, so there is a kind of, two-way thing here. I was in France shortly after the attack on the Hyper Caché, the big super grocery store many years ago. And I saw a lot of this firsthand with French people, non-Jews, rallying in the streets. And I believe it was Sarkozy at the time. Macron has said it too recently, that if France is not a place where Jews can live and live under terms of equality, then France is not France. So there's been a tremendous outpouring of support. In the immediate 1950s, de Gaulle tried to make sure that Jews were welcome back in France. He tried to do what he could to make sure that that was the case. And I believe it's true. I believe I'm right about this, that France has Europe's largest Jewish population even today. I believe I'm right about that. So it is still a place where a lot of European Jews live, though I've spoken to a few that, there are periodic terrorist incidents in France and terrorist alert that make life uncertain for many people.
I mean, especially now with what's happening in Gaza, Palestine
Yeah.
situation, it must be tricky. So and let's not go there. That's an episode for later. But I want to talk a little. We don't want to end soon, but I want to talk a little bit about the occupation period and the French, in popular media, novels, movies, and how this has been portrayed. And I believe there are no shortage of movies. Like there is here in Norway, we get one movie about occupation every year, literally
Yeah.
one or
Yeah.
two every year. And I believe it's the same in France. That it's a very popular topic, both
It
in
is.
fiction, history, and there's a lot of on train stations you can see a full shelf just of occupation history. So let's talk a little bit about how popular this period actually is in French history.
Yeah, it's becoming much more popular, and it's becoming treated in a little bit more of shades of gray than the old black and whites that used to be. There was a French miniseries called The Village that ran for 6 or 7 seasons that brought all of this back in. It was about a small French village and kind of how life was under Vichy. Again, I have to confess, I don't really watch a lot of these fictionalized things. But I have plenty of friends, both non-historians and historians. I just had this discussion just a couple of days ago at lunch. A fellow academic was sort of appalled that I wasn't watching this miniseries. It's just I'm more interested in the history than I am in the fictionalized versions of it. It's a separate kind of thing, but it does indicate, I think, that France is willing to wrestle with these things in its popular culture. It's willing to ask these questions now. And is willing to have a discussion in a way that it wasn't a few years ago. The other thing that I always do, and maybe this is a good place to end, is I like to walk people through Paris and show them the signs of, there are signs on the buildings from which large numbers of Jews, where Jews had lived before World War II. And some of those signs are written in the passive voice. From this building, 500 Jews were deported. Sometimes they'll say something like the Germans deported 500. More recently, when those signs go up, they're saying the Vichy police arrested 500 people because they were born Jewish. So even the language of these signs has changed to indicate that the French government, the French occupation government, or the Vichy government played a very, very active role in the elimination of so many Jews and their murder in the death camps. And as I said, this podcast covering their tracks shows the complicity of the SNCF, the French Railway Company, which knew full well what it was doing, but was content to profit off of what the Germans were doing, the German massacre of French Jews.
I think we're gonna round it up there. Of course, before you go, do you have any social media where people may find you, or if they have a further question about French, and where can people find your book, When France Fell, and anything else you want to share that you are working on, that you want to, give one last comment on before we go?
Yeah, the book is available in all the usual locations. I am on LinkedIn. If folks want to find me there, I'm not on X, but I am on LinkedIn, and folks can reach out to me there. They can also email me at my last name, NEIBERG102 @gmail.com. Yeah, looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great pleasure to have you. You're always welcome back to the podcast, of course. And this has been about that H12. We are available on social media under Twitter/X under that H12. We are now also on Blue Sky under that H12, where you joined last weekend. So please make sure to follow us there. We are also on Instagram under that H12. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you are on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars, or you can give us 1 if you hate this podcast. So it's entirely up to you. It's a free world, at least for now. We'll see you soon. And if you are on Apple Podcasts, consider writing a review. If you are on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.